And I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Alicia Imperiale. Alicia is currently a visiting associate professor of history and theory at Pratt Institute. She also teaches graduate urban design studio at the Yale University School of Architecture and works with the Yale Center for Ecosystems in Architecture. An architect, artist, and theorist, her work investigates the underlying impact of technology on the arts, society, and culture. She is the author, among other books, of New Flatness, Surface Tension in Digital Architecture. Her book projects underway include Alternate Organics, the Aesthetics of Experimentation in Art, Technology, and Architecture in Post-war Italy, and Machine Consequences, Origins of Output. Her work has been supported by fellowships from the American Academy in Rome, a fellowship from the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts, a Temple University Fellowship, and a Cornell University Society for the Humanities Fellowship, among others. Please join me in welcoming Alicia to today's Exactitude. And the talk of her presentation is Machine Consequences. Welcome, Alicia.
Thank you so much, Laure. I'm going to share my screen.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you. So to begin, I would like to thank Dean Barbara Krautheimer, Chair Stephen Schreiber, and Professors Pari Riahi, Laure Kataros, and Michael Davis for the invitation to present my work in the company of such extraordinary colleagues. Yesterday's presentations and visual and musical performances were engaging and inspirational. So in the next half hour, I would like to share with you a particular episode from the book manuscript I'm working on, Machine Consequences, Origins of Output. The book begins with the premise, as the Italian artist Bruno Monari stated in the late 1960s, that in the field of, quote, aesthetic research, what he called visual operators have always been attracted to new technological innovation and instruments. Their relationship is constantly and continuously reinvented. He presciently wrote that these tools or machines, which were first invented to reduce human labor and to increase technological productivity in capitalism, can and have been historically repurposed by artists to explore and experiment in the field of aesthetic creativity. So here we see an exhibit I'll explain a little bit more at the 1970 Venice Biennale. So to think about the concept of machine consequences and a working subtitle, Origins of Output, I shift the focus of scholarship on the computer, emphasizing input to these peripheral objects or machines that are equal actors in the making of aesthetic objects. So the chief question I seek to raise is that artistic agency can engage productively with these machines and disrupt and reimagine their intended purpose and precision. I argue that this cycle has deep historical roots and mirrors the creativity that is overlooked in the inventors of these machines themselves. So I begin by looking at the Venice Biennale of Art in 1970, in which Bruno Monari and others created a research laboratory in which 22 artists produced work on technological machines at the time, such as the serographic press, plexiglass cutters, lithograph stones, and presses, among others, and also a rank Xerox 720 machine. So the artists worked in full sight of the public and then displayed their work at the periphery of the room. And a list of the artists below, which I'm going to show us some of the images. So these are kind of shots of the different pieces. I've put plexiglass or serigraph silkscreen print below them. So the processes and materials speak of the time, the boom in plastics and availability of polystyrene and plexiglass, the interest through pop artists such as Andy Warhol's silkscreen prints, or the large-scale photos modeled from comic books and his paintings, which were shown at Leo Castelli's gallery in New York City, referring to Roy Lichtenstein. He also Lichtenstein also referred to this work, American pop art, quote, not as American painting, but actually industrial painting, end quote. So the transatlantic movement of these ideas is evident in the processes seen here with silkscreen, the classic art of lithography updated with the use of airbrush ink. And we see over on the right in Elsa Magri's work and Bruno Di Bello, photographic processes using the use of wet process photography using large scale enlargers and printing on the then unconventional substrate of canvas. So even the printing press, the printing press is used in a way to elevate domestic objects and decenter their original meaning, as in Ernesto Statafiore's piece on the left, Military of Paper. But it is in Bruno Munari here on the right that we see an enormous change in the relationship between the artist and the machine. Not crediting himself as the author of the work, here, it is titled Xerografia, and it is made or executed by Bruno Munari, the artist. So it's this removal of the artist as genius author, but becoming a visual operator is what I find most intriguing about Munari's work. And here we see a view of the scene with Fabrizio Plessi in residence, as we see him below, working with the silkscreen press, groups of school children on the top, and looking in and participating. And I think I just wanted to note here still that the distact between the audience and the artist, regardless of whether they're kind of occupying the same space. So with a rank Xerox in place, and boxes and reams of A4 paper, this machine was in use by Munari, who then invited other visitors, unlike the children looking into Plessi working, to kind of operate and work with the Xerox machine, and thus extending the idea of visual operator to the public. And what might you ask, does this have to do with the topic at hand in this conference of exactitude? Rather than looking at the exact as a measure of the success of performance, I believe there's an openness of using layers of technology available today in creative and collaborative ways, and that this may be a way to move from the interest in the singular artist to working in the world as an act of meaningful action and imagination, as our conveners have asked us to think about. And why is the work of artists so important to discuss in relationship to architecture? I believe it is important to understand that in these artistic practices, the potential of opening up to the public, to question the role of the author, and also to see the common practices of using machines in unintended ways. And as in this slide from the 28-page catalog produced by Munari that documents his creative use of the Rank Xerox 720 machine. By understanding the technical characteristics of the machine, the artist could improvise and invent new ways of interacting with the machine that were not thought of to begin with. The examples in this catalog begin by showing a group of people in Tokyo at the museum in 1965 during an exhibit of a solo exhibit of his work, and then in the lower to students in Rome. And so just as on a series of these to the right in his what he called xerographic originals, right? Xerografia originale is important in that he is taking us away from the idea of the Xerox machine reproducing almost to an infinite point of view, business documents and so forth. So I wanted to show this by taking, in this case, a black and white photograph of himself. He was able to move with the light bar that was moving below the glass scanning bed and interact with that light bar in time and produce a series of different steps, of different code, of a new system of kind of breaking its intention and producing new work. So throughout the catalog, we see examples of other materials such as burlap here and the elaboration of a set of steps or rules for the action. These are deliberate acts revealing the interaction of the person and the machine. More recently, artists and designers creatively misuse digital output machines, and they become a translational device from code to matter, and the artist's hand as a critical push against the exact dimensional tolerances these machines afford. And they embrace the messiness of matter and material itself. In doing so, the designer's handiwork is made visible in the play of machine and material, allowing the inconsistencies in matter to be made visible, for example, by augmenting the energy in viscous materials that are 3D printed. Material behaviors are always studied in architecture. The aliveness of concrete is tested in on-site slump tests of concrete mix during construction, and these behaviors of matter, as Jane Bennett calls vibrant matter, or Gilbert Simondon described as individuations, are different to Louis Kahn's question, what does the brick want to be? Which assumes an already technologically mediated form of matter. These other alternative modes question the molecular makeup of materials, their kinetic properties and behaviors, and places the artist as a translator, as a transmaker, revealing the scalar changes and the question of precision and exactitude. Unconventional assemblages of 3D printers, hacking machines with unusual and unexpected materials, for example, printing with powdered grape must or fungal material, and using epoxy rather than polymer, or using robotic arms that are reconfigured to move along a gantry system to print steel bridges over small canals, or printing with human or pig cells are just some of the human, animal, mineral machines that I'm examining in this work. And the tension taking to task the tension of the design of the machine in terms of its exactness and precision, and how Homo ludens can push back against that exactness in creative play. Or as we see in the many experiments of the artist Anish Kapoor from 2012 on, in which he uses the various components of the machine, the extrusion, the viscosity of the concrete mix, the humidity in the room, to record the making as an ensemble event. We see this in the weight of the viscous matter of concrete that bulges and breaks, oozes, and finds its own relationship to gravity, hardening into a record of the move against precision, or the exact in the relationship between matter, machine, and human. There is the playful act, or ludic act, in this work, as it pushes back on the precision of the machines. So throughout this project, the idea of machine consequences is really the set of interactions. In later chapters of the book, I focus on the hacking of a Xerox machine, including a laser to produce the laser printer. I look at 3D printing, robotic arms. But for the remainder of my time now, I would like to set out the method of looking at the creator of the machine for a few moments. And by looking at the history of the Xerox machine, used in a way that it goes against its promise of producing identical copies of the original. With the Xerox machine, high speed and virtually infinite, ideally, identical and exact copies were thought to be made possible. And while it had a profound influence on the business world, the expanded possibilities of exact and virtually infinite reproductions would be felt far beyond the walls of commerce. Universities and other cultural institutions leased the Xerox 914, here introduced in 1960, and before long, one could register the impact of this technology, perhaps most significantly through its appropriation and experimentation in art practices. But the inventor, we see to the left in 1938, Chester Carlson, in the attempt to be exact, to produce exact copies, was also transgressive and playful in looking to a combination of various influences that made the machine possible. The electrostatic photocopier is different. There was no immediate material phase between the original and the copy, as in photography or lithography or other modes. In addition, with this process, there was no direct and physical correlation between the original and the copy. It is not mediated by a negative, a plate, or incised wax sheet. Rather, the process breaks down the original image atomistically into singular microscopic elements that then reconstitute the image. The image is made by using a static charge that attracts or repels a particulate toner to translate the image to be copied. This absence of mediation is of great interest to me, as it highlights the relationship between the constitutive element and the whole that is so important in the work of this period. Likewise, the development of the electrostatic copier highlights the other broad themes of the book, the sympathetic connection between science and art. The electrostatic photocopier represents a remarkable shift that was made possible by by explaining certain key scientific discoveries, which would permit the confluence of various processes in the development of the electrostatic photocopier. Invisible to the eye, electromagnetic forces were first studied and visualized by natural philosopher Michael Faraday, who lived from 1791 to 1867. Faraday observed that a cylinder of peroxide of iron, when placed near a magnet, was either attracted or repulsed by the negative and positive poles of the magnet. In his essay on, quote, diamagnetic condition of matter, end quote, he verbally described in great detail what he had seen as the changing positions of the cylinder in relationship to the magnetic repulsion or attraction. So in the diagram to the left. So in this diagram, he describes the unstable movement of the iron cylinder, showing just the central axes as if stopped in the various positions, which are symmetrical around the center line of the magnet. This diagram helped to visualize the invisible forces at work. Some of these diagrams illustrated in the right in Coulomb's law, which, quote, quantifies the force between electrostatic changes and the concept of lines of force, end quote. The visual expression of invisible forces was furthered by studies on the use of ferrous particles that would, when subjected to these forces, become arrayed in patterns that would directly correlate with the electromagnetic forces at play. Other experiments with ferromagnetic materials, such as iron filings, also made visible the invisible forces as they align themselves, quote, along the associated latent magnetic lines of force, revealing the magnetic field generated by an electrical current or electrical charge. So the physical way the ways in which iron filings reveal invisible magnetic forces was an inspiration to Chester Carlson, the inventor of the electrostatic photocopy process. Carlson conducted extensive research into numerous scientific discoveries and patents, and was really absolutely fascinated by Lichtenberg's studies, in addition to combining that with Faraday's work on electromagnetism. Lichtenberg also noted the striking physical similarity of, quote, images produced at Göttingen University in 1777, which reveal these elaborate branch-like patterns which were made visible by dusting isolators exposed to an electric spark. The image is a physical tracing of an invisible and fleeting electric charge. Such figures were produced by placing a needle perpendicular to a non-conducting plate of material such as resin or glass, and then conducting a high voltage surge through the needle to the surface. The surface was dusted then with a sulfite powder mixed with red lead powder, and by pressing a piece of paper to the dust patterns, a visible record of the electric charge was revealed. Much as the ferromagnetic dust filings reveal the electromagnetic forces at play, the electric charge also produced patterns by attracting dust to the positively charged areas during the moment of the electric charge and spark, and the negatively charged areas remain free of powder. So I know this is quite detailed, but it becomes important as in my explanation of how I believe inventors are also creatively working kind of in a parallel way to artists. So what would replicate a document with utmost fidelity and to be an identical and exact copy of an original is completely upended. This larger project examines the standards of reproduction or creation and their tolerances that each output machine affords it, and how it relates to the concepts of efficiency, and now how this is overturned through the intervention of human action. In the case of the Xerox machine, early on, used by artists, the idea of seriality and permutation, changes to the type and norm, were embedded in the interaction between the artist and the machine. So going back to Carlson, let's try to find a different, like a way to kind of look back at him as the inventor, which is the project of the book, is Carlson then combines those two ideas of the ferromagnetic, which I just described before, electromagnetism and ferromagnetism. So he, in 1938, adding the use of a bright discharge of light to the charge and discharged the plate. So we're seeing this on the left. What he took from Lichtenberg's experiments was that the sulfur tended to acquire a slight negative charge, while the red lead a slight positive charge. The negatively charged sulfur would be attracted to the positively charged area of the plate, while the lead would be attracted to the negatively charged areas. His early experiments did not use ink to transfer an image, but a sophisticated use of static electricity. A charge plate was suffused with light, which removed the electric charge from the white areas, while a plastic toner powder was applied to the remaining area. After a process of demagnetizing the paper, the toner was bonded to the paper through heat. So thus, the resulting printout reproduced the original. Carlson called this new process xerography, from the combination of Greek terms meaning dry writing. His patent for electrophotography was, as he called it, was filed on April 4, 1939, and granted finally in 1942. So in the first page of the patent, which I have here to the right, he illustrates in 10 figures the steps in the production of the final image. In the first figure, he shows a cross section through a plate upon which there is an object to be copied. So up in here. So in figures 2, 2A, and 2B, he shows various ways in which the plate will be charged through exposure to a bright light source. In figure 3, he illustrates the dispersion of the polymer particles that will be attracted to the negatively charged areas of the plate. And the following images show the process of removing the excess particles from the plate. The plates then formed a sandwich in which the paper, so we see that at the bottom here, I can't find my mouse. The plates then form a sandwich in which the paper is to receive the polymer particles. The plate is discharged of its electrical charge and affixed. And finally, fused through heat and pressure, reproduces the final image that was copied. So advances kind of came through the 1940s. He developed an early version of the model with the Haloid Corporation, and he marketed it as Model A in 1945. It required a laborious process in which the copies were processed one by hand with separate compartments. One exposed the original, another holds the toner, and a third bonds the toner to the paper, all housed within a decidedly retro wood encasing. It would take another 9 years to make an automatic high-speed copier possible. Key to the development was the replacement, as we see to the right, of a charged flat plate with a drum, which would then be the circumference of the length of the paper. So in the debut in 1960 of the Xerox 914 machine by Haloid Xerox revolutionized the role of document duplication in the office, even as the company's focus on promoting this product aided in the proliferation of bureaucratic practices. Advertising was key. While the image of the developers grouped around the 648-pound behemoth might improve sales, alternate, quote, unique and fresh approaches toward the advertising of the product, as we see in this doll-sized woman, were to make the 914 all the more appealing. So with the Xerox machine, high-speed and virtually infinite copies were possible. And while it had a profound influence on the business world, the expanded possibilities of reproduction would be felt far beyond the walls of commerce. Universities and other cultural institutions leased the Xerox 914, and before long, one could register the impact of this technology, perhaps most significantly through its appropriation and experimentation in art practices. And as a side note, couldn't quite fit it into the presentation today. The Xerox company, Rank Xerox, had the Xerox Art Lab Park on the West Coast, and the interaction with Rank Xerox and having the artist Bruno Munari was also part of that feedback loop in R&D. So anyway, this is where our story returns to Munari's playfulness with the Xerox machine in my last few slides. So through a systematic experimentation, he was able to expose other levels of order in the random processes of making copies, yet countered with the assertion that each copy was in fact original in series, rather than creating an artistic finality. Munari experimented in his performance of making a photocopy with different materials, photographs, images, non-figurative perforated plastic sheets, meshes, organic materials, his own face, transparent plastics, paper, of various thicknesses and transparencies. He also experimented with various models of the photocopier, adjusted and played with the toner, using the mechanical aspects of the machine as productive variables in the production of an image. Looking at the work of Munari now is a way to open up a larger discussion about the transatlantic discussions of artists between the US and Europe at that time. but also as a marker for the multi-leveled and yet more invisible and simultaneous of transmission of ideas through exhibits, publications that easily move across air and sea. His contribution is most important as he saw the use of the photocopier as having an innate importance for all people to make art, not just those with artistic training. This political, democratic use of the photocopier is a crucial contribution to art theory and practice. If you want to arrive at an art that is for everyone, it's necessary to find instruments that facilitate artistic production and contemporaneously to give all the methods and the preparation for how to operate them. The technological possibility of our era can allow for each person the ability to operate and reproduce produce something that will have an aesthetic value. So the rank Xerox machines for Munari opened this up. They were invented to reproduce images. Now they can produce them. And I'm missing one slide, but we're okay. I just have the last comment. So Munari reminds us, so one of the duties of the visual operator will be to experiment, to seek out instruments suitable for general use and to pass them on with all the, quote, secrets of the trade that facilitate their operation. Rank Xerox machines at the time, anybody could express themselves. They were invented to reproduce images. Now we can produce them. Naturally, like all other means, they too have their limitations. But if one thinks of the mechanical limitations of the piano, for example, he asks us to think about, with which a long note is impossible. And he said that yet no one would deny that the piano is a suitable instrument for the production of sonorous works of art. As with any other means, it is therefore a question of operating within certain limitations and of not aspiring to immediate masterpieces. So as Munari saw the Xerox machine having this power to allow any person to produce something that has an aesthetic value, it's important to invite us to see today in the proliferation of 3D printers and other output machines, the proliferation of maker spaces. It asks us and invite us to address the inequities in access to technologies and gives us the impetus of the work we must do to make that available. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Alicia. I'd like to encourage people in the audience to ask questions through the Q&A if they wish to. So you can just type your question and someone will relay your question to Alicia. I had a question. Thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. I'll never look at my Xerox my machine in the same way again after hearing you. I think I'm going to try to be a lot more creative instead of just copying documents. I was wondering about the role of chance or chaos or unintended consequences in Munari's artwork. Do you think of this as perhaps the opposite of the idea of of a facsimile of exactly reproducing something? Is this something that he wanted to highlight?
No, absolutely, Laure. It's a really good point. As I was trying to edit into the time, the piece that I'll be working on for the later publication includes much more of that. And actually, there was quite an active interest in the artistic circles around Umberto Eco and his idea of the open work and the openness to chance and operation that really was at play here. Also, something I didn't really get to kind of fold in here as I was explaining the mechanicals of this, that was seen very much in the philosopher Abraham Moles and Max Bense, who had a huge influence in Italy at the time, who were also collaborating with many of these artists and really talking about that ability of chance to kind of open up these kind of more democratic possibilities. So unfortunately, I didn't get to all of that in the talk today, but I think that's an incredible question that really is there, and it's definitely writing about chaos. And Bruno Munari was also in some of those circles with the programmed art group and this kind of fertile discussion happening with in art at the time in Italy. So.
Thank you so much. Harry, Michael, would you like to ask?
I'm going to ask a question to Alicia. First of all, thank you so much. That was, yes, I think we'll all look at our Xerox machines differently now. One of the the kind of threads that I picked up in the early part of your presentation is that what fascinates you in a way is that the machines, the artists are working with the machines, but also trying to kind of open up the work to the public. And so I think the question, or the open question, is, would you imagine that an architecture of the kind would also be desirable? Because often these two threads are completely separated in the contemporary field. You're either working with the machine or you're working into opening architecture to the public, but very rarely the two of them kind of come together. And so I can imagine that part of it is because going back to this whole idea of the technophobia or the technophilia, a lot of working with the machine in architecture has really consumed the architect's energy in trying to really kind of master or control or figure out how to work with the machine. But I just wondered, is that something that you have noticed or you observed, or you look at it very differently?
No, no, very much. I mean, that's the thread I'm really trying to pull together through the larger work. And, you know, was the idea, you know, because there can be the technophobia to not touch those machines. But I think in Munari, I found an interest, and I see Eric is here this morning as well. And, you know, if we go back to the spring with Eric at Harvard or Jenny Sabin at Cornell, working with the medical centers, producing PPE, an idea of a, you know, like, I think that was a really public act and something that tends to be kind of set toward private practice or within the university. So it's like ideas about, there's definitely that idea of making machines accessible. There's later, and I am thinking actively through these conditions, and it's in that way that Munari like becomes this beacon for me, in the way that he did invite people in, or he tried to decenter that role. So like the thinking of the 1960s, bringing that to bear, kind of the more contemporary issue, an idea of access and kind of, and I think this period that we've been in, it's making me think about the project in a different way as well, you know, in terms of access to technology and not in this, you know, great divides in society worldwide. So I don't know if that really answers the question. You know, I've been hopeful in seeing, you know, public libraries, which now with COVID, you know, are not accessible any longer, but there was much more an idea of getting some of these materials or having them kind of not just kind of set aside in universities or having to have access to them in a particular way. So there was something, but the other side of this though is I do hold on to kind of even someone like Antonio Negri talked about like the like working as an intellectual worker, or some way to like understand certain access and certain, you know, that the artist has this place in the world to kind of move and question and not necessarily deny the aesthetic output. So that's also a concept I'm trying to work through as well, and how that can be innately political, innately democratic, and where does that role of the author come in, which I think so much in architecture, and in your brief as well, you know, asking the kind of the role of the architect author, and can where, you know, are we parts of larger teams, and you know, understanding, I don't know, Antonio Negri work is important for me in that realm as well, of just trying to think about the various roles of what you bring to bear. So that's a kind of roundabout way of how I've been trying to beat this project into its form for some time. But
that's great, thank you. Before Michael asks the next question, I just want to say that as a general rule for the day, our panelists can unmute themselves at any moment and ask a question, so feel free. And Michael, back to you.
Yes, we have I think a very apposite follow-up question from the audience that asks, Alicia, your talk focuses on the work of artists and inventors. Do you think that architects approach these questions of innovation and material behaviors differently than artists? What might architects learn from the processes you describe?
Great, thanks for the question from the audience. Yes, I do think that as architects, I think that there can be, let's say, the work of Anish Kapoor, there's not the demand for the work to be performative. It's the comment on itself. So I do think that there's something different between the art object and the way we then work as architects. So I think a very poor comparison would be to look at like the 3D printed houses at particular scale versus, let's say, the failures of Anish Kapoor. But I think Eric in his talk yesterday, kind of speaking of like working with this, very, very advanced machines, but working with, non-dimensional lumber or having these interfaces. I think that there is a lot of creativity to re-examine that then can have kind of ethical and implications in terms of extractive technologies and kind of reuse and so forth, that I think can be powerful conversations. And I do think I really did focus very much on like artists of this period in Italy, but I think one part of that is not really going to be in this particular book project, but these kind of ways of thinking about kind of seriality or change were also ways that in the post-war period in Italy were thought of as a way to produce non-standard houses, let's say, versus housing. The housing needs in Europe after the war were immense. And so here it was a ways that like by introducing chance and variation, that you could produce kind of an organic complexity that might begin to emulate. So I think that that's a great question. I don't want to take up, I don't want to go over my time too much, but I do think that there's, the book will also begin, it really does include many more architectural practices and how, kind of like actually engaging at the scale of building or of component of understanding the difference of being able to build in kind of disaster area. I think that there's so many aspects to it that open up into architecture.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I am an architect, I've trained as an artist. And so I think I have that tendency to perhaps read the artistic operations and try to find the ways that they relate into the field. And then as a historian, looking very much into the period of the post-war 1960 to the early 70s in Italy, finding kind of early, the Xerox machine is not an output machine, it's not connected to the computer as its output, but it becomes a transitional device where I think that already is being hacked in this way by Munari. And, many architects use the Xerox machines at that time for, copying something, thinking through multiple iterations of prefabricated buildings and including great variation and individual identity and opening that maybe up to more public practices of interaction. So I don't know. So
yeah, I wonder if I could ask a brief question. In the slide that you showed that gathered the work of Terraform and Jenny Sabin and Neri Oxman and Rui Klein, you were suggesting that, or I don't know, perhaps that implied that artists are working in very experimental ways, pushing kind of the boundaries and envelope of materials. And I wondered if one finds the migration of some of these experimental results and new possibilities with material crossing the boundary into architectural practice.
absolutely. And we have people here with us in these 2 days that are kind of at the cutting edge of that. I was pointing to a number of practices that I think are doing so. So to be fair to my architectural colleagues, I think today in the presentation, I focused more on Munari and kind of trying to follow that case in Exactitude, and it just became too big otherwise. But it's like the perfect, it's with that same eye that I want to kind of really reflect on practices over, past, especially past 10 years, but like almost 20 years. So I don't know if that's a fair answer, but
Thank you.
thanks.
I'm just gonna give it one moment to see if we do have any more questions. If not, because I sense that there was one coming, but I guess it might be perhaps for a further, more amicable and less public conversation then. Alicia, thank you so much for the talk.
Thank you all again for listening and for the invitation. See you through the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.